What if the bravest thing you ever do isn't winning, succeeding, or proving yourself, but getting back up after you fall without pretending it didn't hurt? Rising Strong is not a book about avoiding failure. It's a book about what happens when courage doesn't work out the way we hoped, when vulnerability leads to disappointment, shame, or heartbreak, and how we rise again with more truth, clarity, and strength than before. Brené Brown argues that falling is not the opposite of courage. Falling is the physics of courage. If you are brave enough, long enough, you will fall. The real question is not whether you'll fall, but whether you'll rise strong. Brown frames this book as the final piece in a trilogy. If The Gifts of Imperfection was about being yourself, and Daring Greatly was about showing up fully, Rising Strong is about what happens when showing up knocks you down. Through years of research and thousands of stories, Brown noticed a gap. We celebrate bravery and resilience, but we rarely talk honestly about the messy middle, the confusion, self-doubt, and emotional chaos between falling and getting back up. She introduces the core idea. Rising strong is a process. It requires reckoning with our emotions, rumbling with our stories, and living into a new way forward. Skipping any part of this process leads to denial, blame, or false strength. Chapter 1. The Physics of Vulnerability. Brené Brown begins by dismantling one of the most deeply held myths about courage, the belief that bravery somehow protects us from pain. In reality, courage guarantees discomfort. Vulnerability is not the risk we take after preparing for every outcome. It is stepping into uncertainty knowing that failure, criticism, or heartbreak is not just possible, but inevitable. Brown explains that if we are brave enough, often enough, we will fall. This is not pessimism. It is emotional physics. Just as gravity pulls us down, vulnerability carries consequences. To choose courage is to sign up for being hurt at some point. The mistake many people make is believing they can choose bravery while opting out of the emotional cost. She also highlights a quieter grief that follows falling. Once we dare and fall, we can never return to who we were before. Awareness permanently changes us. We may long for the version of ourselves that was less exposed, less disappointed, or less aware of our own limits. Rising strong requires grieving that former self while still moving forward. Another key truth in this chapter is that rising is deeply personal but never meant to be done alone. Humans are wired for story and connection. We heal through empathy, storytelling, creativity, and meaning-making. Brown emphasizes that creativity helps embed what we learn emotionally into how we live, transforming insight into practice. Rising strong is not about quick fixes. It is about integration. Chapter 2, Civilization Stops at the Waterline. This chapter uses a deeply personal story to illustrate how quickly shame and misunderstanding can arise in moments of vulnerability. Brown shows how, when emotions flood our system, our brains instinctively create stories to explain what's happening. These stories feel true, but they're often driven by fear rather than facts. At the heart of this chapter is one of Brown's most powerful tools, naming the story I'm telling myself. This phrase creates a critical pause between what actually happened and the meaning we assign to it. By separating facts from assumptions, we create space for curiosity instead of defensiveness. Brown also introduces the idea of the messy middle. This is the uncomfortable space between starting something brave and reaching clarity or resolution. Whether in relationships, leadership, or creativity, this middle phase is unavoidable. The temptation is to rush through it, numb it, or escape it altogether. Her central warning is simple but profound. You can't skip the middle. Growth, healing, and transformation requires staying present in discomfort long enough to learn from it. Civilization, our emotional composure, clarity, and values, often stops the moment we feel threatened. Rising strong means reclaiming it. Chapter 3. Owning Our Stories. In this chapter, Brown makes a bold claim. If we don't own our stories, they own us. Avoidance, denial, and distortion don't eliminate pain. They give it more power. The stories we refuse to face often show up later as resentment, blame, or shame. Owning our stories does not mean blaming ourselves or others. It means telling the truth about what happened, how it affected us, and what it means. Brown explains that shame thrives in secrecy and silence. When stories remain hidden, they grow heavier and more distorted. Courage, in this context, is not oversharing or emotional exposure without boundaries. It is honest integration, being willing to acknowledge our experiences without exaggeration or minimization. This process restores agency. Instead of being passive characters in stories written by fear, we become authors again. Brown emphasizes that owning our stories also allows for empathy. When we accept our own imperfections and struggles, we become less reactive and more compassionate toward others. This chapter lays the emotional groundwork for the deeper work ahead. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The reckoning is the first active stage of rising strong. It begins the moment we fall, when something doesn't go as planned and our emotional system is overwhelmed. Brown explains that during these moments, our nervous system reacts faster than our rational mind. We experience emotional flooding. Our bodies tense, our thoughts race, and our perception narrows. In this state, we are highly vulnerable to shame-driven narratives. The reckoning is about recognizing that we are triggered and choosing awareness instead of autopilot. Brown encourages us to get curious about our emotions rather than judging them. Asking simple but powerful questions. What am I feeling? Why does this hurt so much? What story am I telling myself? Helps slow the process down. This stage is not about fixing anything yet. It is about acknowledging pain without numbing it or displacing it onto others. The reckoning requires emotional honesty and the courage to stay present when everything inside us wants to escape. Chapter 5, The Rumble. The rumble is the most demanding part of the rising strong process. This is where we lean into uncertainty and examine the stories we created during emotional upheaval. Brown defines rumbling as a commitment to curiosity, honesty, and vulnerability. During the rumble, we question our assumptions. We ask what we know for sure, what we don't know, and where we might be filling in gaps with fear-based interpretations. This stage often involves discomfort, self-doubt, and the temptation to retreat into blame or defensiveness. Brown stresses that stories are powerful, but not always accurate. Without examination, they can reinforce shame and disconnection. Rumbling allows us to reality check these narratives and revise them when necessary. The goal of the rumble is clarity, not perfection, not control. It requires humility and emotional bravery. By staying engaged in this process, we move closer to truth and prepare ourselves for the transformation that follows. Chapter 6, Sewer Rats and Scofflaws. In this chapter, Brené Brown turns her attention to one of the most painful realities of choosing courage: criticism. When we dare greatly and fall, feedback is inevitable, but not all feedback deserves our attention. Brown introduces the metaphor of sewer rats and scofflaws to describe people who attack from a distance. These are critics who are not engaged in the work themselves. They don't show up vulnerably, take risks, or stand in the arena. Instead, they lob judgments, cruelty, or ridicule from the cheap seats. Their criticism often feels personal and devastating, but it is rarely constructive. The key distinction Brown makes is between feedback from people who are in the arena with us and commentary from those who are not. Only feedback from people who are willing to risk discomfort, who know what it feels like to fall, and who care about our growth is worth considering. To help navigate this, Brown introduces the idea of the square squad. This is the small group of people whose opinions genuinely matter: trusted friends, mentors, or loved ones who are both kind and honest. Rising strong requires learning to ignore anonymous cruelty and choosing instead to listen carefully to those who have earned the right to be heard. Chapter 7, The Brave and Brokenhearted. This chapter focuses on heartbreak. Not just romantic heartbreak, but any experience of deep disappointment, loss, or unmet expectations. Brown reframes heartbreak as a natural consequence of courage. If we love deeply, hope boldly, and care fully, heartbreak will eventually follow. Rather than treating heartbreak as a personal failure, Brown encourages us to see it as evidence that we showed up with an open heart. The alternative, emotional numbing or detachment, may reduce pain, but it also blocks joy, connection, and meaning. Brown explores how grief often arrives alongside shame. We question whether we should have known better, tried harder, or protected ourselves more. Rising strong means allowing ourselves to grieve honestly, without rushing toward false positivity or premature closure. The courage to remain emotionally available after heartbreak is one of the clearest signs of wholehearted living. Healing does not mean forgetting or minimizing pain. It means integrating loss into our story without letting it define our worth. Chapter 8, Easy Mark. In this chapter, Brown examines self-blame and how quickly we turn against ourselves when things go wrong. Being an easy mark means internalizing failure and assuming that we are the problem. Brown explains that shame convinces us that harsh self-criticism will motivate improvement. In reality, self-attack shuts down learning and reinforces fear. It keeps us small rather than accountable. True accountability, Brown argues, requires compassion. Compassion does not excuse behavior, but it creates the emotional safety needed to take responsibility without collapsing into shame. Rising strong means learning to recognize shame spirals and interrupt them with curiosity and self-kindness. When we treat ourselves with empathy, we are more capable of growth, repair, and resilience. Chapter 9, Composting Failure. Failure is unavoidable, but how we process it determines whether it becomes a source of wisdom or a breeding ground for shame. Brown uses the metaphor of composting to describe this process. Compost is messy, uncomfortable, and often unpleasant, but it creates fertile soil. In the same way, failure must be examined, reflected upon, and integrated if it is to become useful. Brown emphasizes that avoiding failure or rushing past it robs us of learning. Rising strong requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for insight to emerge. When we compost failure, we extract meaning rather than punishment. This allows us to move forward with greater clarity and humility instead of fear. Chapter 10. You gotta dance with them that brung you. This chapter centers on values. When we are afraid, criticized, or uncertain, our instinct is often to abandon the principles that once guided us. Brown reminds us that integrity is choosing values over approval. Rising strong means returning to what matters most, especially when it would be easier to compromise. She encourages readers to identify their core values and use them as anchors during difficult moments. Values are not ideals we admire. They're commitments we live, even when doing so is uncomfortable. Staying true to our values gives us stability when external validation disappears. It also strengthens self-trust, which is essential for resilience. Chapter 11, The Revolution. The final stage of Rising Strong is what Brown calls the revolution. This is where the insights gained from reckoning and rumbling are transformed into new ways of living. Rising strong does not return us to who we were before we fell. Instead, it reshapes how we show up in relationships, leadership, and creativity. We become more honest, more compassionate, and more grounded in our values. Brown emphasizes that courage is contagious. When we live openly and authentically, we give others permission to do the same. This creates cultural change, not just personal growth. The revolution is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, consistent, and rooted in truth. Rising strong becomes a practice, a way of engaging with life that honors vulnerability, connection, and courage. Rising strong teaches us that falling is not failure. It's proof that we dared. Rising is not about bouncing back unchanged, but rising with deeper self-trust, wisdom, and courage. Falling hurts. The dare is to keep being brave and feel your way back up.